Welcome back to Next Gen Leaders, where we talk with people rethinking about how we eat, live, and care for the planet. Today, I'm here with Miss Kathleen, who is the CEO and co-founder of Savor, a California-based startup, which is making fats or different kind of fats or a clean label ingredient out of carbon. So, welcome to the show, Miss Kathleen.
Thank you.
So, to start, can you tell me whenever you meet someone, like when you tell them you're making, let's say, butter out of air, out of carbon, so what's their first reaction to it?
It's kind of interesting. Most people don't even know where to start, right? It kind of blows their mind. They're like, what do you mean? You're making food out of air, you're making food out of carbon. And it always makes me kind of laugh because your food is already made out of air. It's already made out of carbon, right? Like that's how photosynthesis works, is that there's carbon dioxide in the air and plants pull it out of the air and build it up into molecules. And we do the exact same thing. We just do it without photosynthesis. We do it using our own kind of synthesis. So it's always funny to me when that idea of making food from air kind of like lands so stunningly with people because actually that's where your food comes from already.
Yep. So, Kathleen, most of us like start our day with butter, cheese, or you can say oil, but we never think about what it's really costing the planet. So, how big is the hidden problem behind the fats we eat every day?
It's interesting. I've spent my whole career thinking about climate and sustainability and technology at that intersection. And for most of my kind of childhood and professional career, the role of the food system and agriculture in that equation has been kind of ancillary or adjacent. That, oftentimes when we think about decarbonization or we think about sustainability, we're thinking about electrification of transportation. We're thinking about building materials like cements and steels. And the food system actually is one of the biggest drivers of climate change on our planet. And the reason for that is that its footprint is enormous. So just kind of, if we think about all the different metrics of how humans interface with our planet, we currently use about 50% of all habitable land for feeding ourselves. We use about 70% of all the world's freshwater withdrawals for our agricultural system. About 20 to 30% of all climate change is because of the food system. And it's interesting because it does just kind of sit adjacent to how a lot of people are thinking about sustainability and decarbonization. So then now if we kind of have wrapped our heads around the food system being actually this like really big footprint in terms of sustainability, I would also posit that it's like an incredible opportunity in terms of sustainability because we actually haven't innovated that much in how we make food. So there's a lot of room to make progress there. And we can get to that if you're interested. But maybe just kind of drilling down a little bit within the food system to thinking about those different macronutrients, because at Savor, we specifically work in fats and oils. The primary drivers of climate impact in the food system are the macronutrients that we eat. So less so actually like vegetables and produce, but more like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And within each of those, it's actually the biggest total footprint comes from carbohydrates. On a like per gram basis, it's less than say proteins or fats, but we eat more carbohydrates than anything else. And so on a volume basis, it's the biggest factor. Then fats and oils, and then actually proteins is kind of the smallest of the footprint if you just look at all of the macronutrients that we're producing. And so specifically for fats and oils, we've kind of done an amortization looking at the impact on a climate basis. And it's about 7% of all anthropogenic emissions that we can map specifically to the production of fats and oils. And so for us, that's kind of a huge opportunity again, where it's like equivalent to, the entire cement industry or kind of all the cars on the road that's kind of the piece of the pie that corresponds to that 7% number.
Okay. So you make butter from carbon. Like that sounds like almost impossible to so many people, like eating air. So how did you make that real, and what does it actually taste like?
Well, hopefully before too long, we can get you a sample to try for yourself. But
Absolutely.
wonderful. Let's see if we can make that happen. In terms of how we make butter with our process. So again, if you think of how butter is made today, is you have carbon dioxide from the atmosphere getting fixed by some plants, built up into structures that are like carbohydrates and proteins and fats, or in some cases like starches that are not actually available energy to humans, but that might be available energy to other creatures like ruminants. Those structures, those molecules get fed to a cow. The cow eats those, and then it transforms those molecules into new molecules, some of which take the form of milk. We milk the cow, we get the milk, we make the butter. So that's a lot of steps. At the end, you have butter. That's a material. It's made up of many different compounds, but the bulk of those compounds are of a specific type called a triglyceride. So that's like the science name for fat. A fat or an oil. This is a triglyceride. And so if you look at butter, it's about 80% triglycerides and about 20% water. And so then if you go look at what a triglyceride is made up of, it's actually made up of some kind of pretty simple building blocks. A glycerol molecule, that's a 3-carbon molecule with 3 alcohol groups on it, and then 3 different fatty acids. And the set of fatty acids that are present on the triglyceride mixture in butter are what make give it its kind of butter fingerprint. If you go look at palm oil, if you go look at soybean oil, those are also triglycerides, they're fats. But the fingerprint of the different types of fatty acids that are in those are different. And that's what differentiates one kind of agricultural fat from another. So at Savor, what we do is we kind of looked at, is there a way that I could make fatty acids or glycerol and put them together to achieve a butter that didn't require the plant to fix the carbon, to feed to the cow, to convert the molecule? Like, could I just make those on my own with some of the tools that we already have in organic chemistry? And the answer is actually yes. You can go, so what you need for this recipe is you need a source of carbon, a source of hydrogen, and a source of oxygen, because those are the elements that make up our triglyceride or our fatty acids. And so if we go source, typically we'll source the carbon and the oxygen and hydrogen either from CO2 and green hydrogen or from methane and water. And then you essentially can build those up into long chains, add some additional oxygen to turn them into fatty acids, and then you've got your building blocks for making butter. And so then you now just have this like fun problem of like, how do you make sure that the thing you get tastes like butter instead of like palm oil, for example?
Yes.
And one of the keys there is like, how does it melt in your mouth? And so we have some like sophisticated tools for measuring melting profile. And so we kind of iterated a lot of times to combine the right set of fatty acids to get to a melting profile that is indistinguishable from that of dairy butter. So you will find if you eat our butter and you eat dairy butter, at least according to like some blind professional tasters, they're actually not distinguishable on a texture basis. Are the flavor notes in ours, we have like a little rosemary oil that we add to it that gives it kind of a grassy note, so that you will notice like some differences in the flavor profile, but on a texture basis, they're actually indistinguishable.
Okay. So when did you personally realize that the way we make food, especially fats, couldn't go on like this? Was there a single moment or story that pushed you to start this Savor?
That is a fun question. The year that we started thinking about this was 2020, during the pandemic, and my co-founder was a few steps ahead of me, Ian McKay. He was a few steps ahead of me in terms of thinking about this problem in a new way. I, again, had worked in sustainability for all of my career, but not really thought about the food system. And I think Ian specifically he just had one of these moments, like on an airplane looking out the window, and you just look at like acre after acre after acre of agricultural land. And it's really, the magnitude of it is certainly humbling. Like our little species here has like been pretty busy for the last 10,000 years, like doing this good job of like making food for us everywhere. You and I, like, at least I, live in a part of the world where I don't have to worry too much about how food gets to a grocery store. Like it's that's not part of my day to day very often. But when you think about that, but when you're, kind of like looking down at it all and how massive this organization is that like makes food for people, I think Ian just got very interested in like, wow, we've really kind of consumed the whole planet. Like, do we really have to enslave, like these plants, like to have this slavery system to make food for ourselves? And that kind of got us looking at, again, this kind of like more direct way of making food molecules. Though his first idea was like, let's take petroleum oil, because that's like very energy dense and available, and turn that into food for people. And we kind of quickly were like, okay, that actually is going to be problematic. It's hard to it's possible to do that, but we decided that was not the best idea. So it was kind of a fun arc looking at all the different ways that you could make food.
Okay. So let's say if tomorrow every bakery, restaurant, and home started using Savor's butter instead of, other dairy palm oil. So what would actually change?
So you highlighted something that's kind of interesting there. You noted like, what if they started using our products instead of dairy or palm oil? So you'll notice that actually, like, we already acknowledge that fats are somewhat interchangeable in the food system. There's, in a chocolate bar, you might see palm oil, you might see a couple of different types of palm oil, or a vegetable oil and a coconut oil and a milk fat. So we're already using many different types of fats. So in terms of your experience of the products that you're eating, you actually might not see that much difference between, the croissant that you go get from a bakery or the chocolate bar that you eat. Those will still be delicious and incredible. But the result is that if we were able to transform kind of like all of those fats and oils from their existing agricultural sources to Savor's process, you wind up freeing up about 15% of habitable land on our planet. So that would be like you found Australia. And so here's this right, we use like pretty lush ecosystems right now for growing things like palm oil. That's all land now that we kind of get to make a new mandate about. Like, do we want to rewild these, to restore these lands? How is it that we want to interact with our planet if we don't need so much of it to feed ourselves?
So you are using carbon, hydrogen, and a catalyst to like literally build fats. So can you break down in simple terms how that works for the people to understand?
Unfortunately, I think, well, we can give it a try, but I think you said it pretty simply, and it starts getting more complicated from there. But let's try, and then you can help me get to the right altitude for your audience. But so say that you start with carbon dioxide and hydrogen, and we want to make a fat. The first step of that is to make something that's called synthesis gas, or syngas.
Okay.
And this is kind of like the first step of almost all organic chemistry, or not almost, much organic chemistry that we do in the world today. Synthesis gas is made up of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and it's a more reactive gas than those starting materials on their own. And so they want to polymerize and build together into longer molecules. So essentially, like whether you're starting with methane and water or CO2 and green hydrogen, the first step is to like make those a little bit more reactive, because otherwise they're just kind of inert. And so there are a couple of processes by which you can do this. But in the case of CO2 and green hydrogen, it's called a reverse water gas shift process. In the case of methane and water, it's called steam methane reforming. But in both cases, you wind up now with this like very useful mixture of gases that's carbon monoxide and hydrogen. The next step then is to get those carbon monoxide and hydrogen to build up into long kind of linear chains of just carbon and hydrogen. And typically that's done most effectively with a catalyst. There's a couple of different kind of processes that have been scaled over the years. But essentially what happens is that the carbon monoxide kind of lands on your catalyst, and then hydrogen is able to add to it when it's sitting on the catalyst. And then one by one, additional carbons come and land on the catalyst and then hook into the chain. And then eventually you release from the catalyst particle, and then you have you've moved from the gas state to this kind of like long chain of carbons. And so there's a lot of science associated with like, what's the distribution of chain lengths of carbon, of carbon chains that you made that then dictates some downstream properties. So that's kind of like the first magic, is to take this gas, get it to condense into this long solid chain. And then the kind of fun part that we do is we then have to add oxygen to that to turn it into a fatty acid. And so we do this oxidation process where we kind of take those carbon chains, we heat them up, we add oxygen, and the result of that is that we make fatty acids that we then get to purify and form all these fun triglyceride mixtures with.
Okay. So, okay.
Was it simpler or too complicated?
I think it is the easiest explanation. Let's hope our audience will get this. So many startups are exploring like fermentation or lab grown fats. So where does Savor hold a unique advantage? Like, is it cost, scalability, purity, or something else?
There are a couple of advantages. There's certainly use cases for those technologies as well, but we specifically are scaling this approach at Savor because of scalability. So when we kind of mapped out all the different techno-economic pathways, this was the one route that we identified where we could at world scale compete on cost directly with palm oil. We couldn't find another route that could get you down to those costs. And the reason, there's a couple of advantages that you have that let you get to those costs. One is just that this is an organic chemistry process. And so you have this volumetric scaling. That's why a lot of all the cheapest commodity chemicals in the world are made with organic chemistry. In the case of a biology or fermentation process, you typically they're like in a pretty dilute system. You have a lot of water. And so as you scale up, you don't the volumetric scaling advantage that you get just in capital and efficiency is not as profound. And then there's also kind of a yield advantage that you have. For example, if you have a fermentation process, essentially part of the carbon that you feed to the organism, say you have to feed them sugar or you have to feed them something, and that can have its own cost. Part of that has to keep your organism alive. And so it's both, just like all of the rest of our agricultural system, if you're keeping alive an organism while producing your molecules, you have this inherent inefficiency because you have to drive a metabolism. Whereas for us, we don't have to drive a metabolism on top of our synthesis. We can just directly synthesize our molecules. And so that yield advantage winds up meaning that your cost floor can be lower. So it's those things on the process side that are advantageous. And then on the product side, because we are kind of doing this, building up these molecules from scratch, you wind up having a lot of tunability over the different types of fats that you can make. And so we can, pretty easily make a tallow versus a lard versus a palm oil with just adjusting the the fatty acid profile that we're going to put in our final triglyceride. If you have a cellular agriculture approach that you're using, you have to go kind of re-engineer your upstream organism to make a new fat. So that's something that's like a little bit different. That's something of a product advantage. That said, there may be some kind of key properties or some other compounds that you express in your cell-grown approach or in your fermentation approach that we don't specifically make on our side. So I really do think there are kind of like clear use cases where you're going to want to use a fermentation approach. You're going to want to use a cell cultivated approach. But for a lot of the kind of bulk fats that we consume, we feel like we have just being able to compete on cost and getting to quality that we can achieve is an advantage.
Okay, so you have already launched a butter alternative. Like, so who is actually using it today? Like our chefs or bakeries or like big food brands. So who are using it today?
So out in the world for sale, our core partners are kind of very high-end chefs still. A couple of examples are Single Thread is a Michelin-starred restaurant up in Healdsburg, California, where they're using our butter in their restaurant. We had a couple of activations with folks like Dirt Candy out in New York and Jane the Bakery here in San Francisco. We have a partnership with a restaurant called 165 here in San Francisco, where our bonbons are being made with them that are for sale both on our website and then actually in their store. So there are a couple of places throughout the US right now where there are physical places people can go show up and get products that have our butter in them. That said, the majority of our production and our commercial focus is on large commercial relationships. So you can think kind of all the largest consumer packaged good or B2B ingredient suppliers are folks that we work with. And so with those partners, we are, depending on the partner, in some stage of either pilot trials or joint development product work towards large commercial offtake. So we wanted to be able to connect with people directly. So we made this butter and brought it to restaurants, but the bulk of our actual kind of commercial development is with large businesses.
Okay. So you are now moving from like pilot scale to larger production. So what does that next phase look like? What scale do you need to make this truly affordable and accessible to everyone?
So we have a small factory outside of Chicago. This factory historically processed fish oils at about 1,000 tons a year. And I can give some examples to help contextualize that for people who don't think about how many tons is a lot for fats and oils. It's not a lot. 1,000 is not that much. We actually are currently only operating that factory at about 5 tons a year because when we purchased it, we had to retrofit it. And that was the scale that we could get to with the capital we had on hand. We're actually just wrapping up a fundraise to be able to scale up production in that facility to several hundred tons per year. That's kind of the scale that we need in order to continue to service our large commercial partners, to grow in our market presence in the US. It is not quite at cost parity with milk fat from that, like commodity milk fat from that factory. So for us, our first commercial scale facility is a facility that we actually have fully engineered already that will produce fats and oils that are on cost parity with commodities like cocoa butter and milk fat and some of the like higher cost cuts of palm oil. And so that factory, we are working towards getting that financed so that it can be commissioned in 2029. And so all of our kind of commercial partnerships today are feeding into the demand pipeline for that first commercial facility. Now that first price point, though, that's still not competitive yet with something like palm oil. For us to compete with palm oil, we really have to be producing at the scale that palm oil is produced at. So if you think of like a large confectionery company, someone that makes like your favorite candy bar, they use hundreds of thousands of tons of fats and oils in a year. And so essentially for and that's kind of the scale at which palm oil gets refined and produced at today. The large kind of palm oil refineries tend to be a couple 100,000 tons of annual production capacity. And so that's really the scale that we are working to target in order to compete on cost with palm oil as well. And that's also in terms of having the impact we want to have also necessary for us, where if you look at kind of expectations around rising demand for palm oil in the next decade, there could be an extra 10 million tons a year of demand for palm oil by 2035. If we want to make sure that we don't have to deforest like one more acre of rainforest in order to like meet that demand, then we Savor like really have to scale rapidly to help mitigate that.
Okay, so before we wrap up, like when people think about Savor years from now, so what do you hope they remember it for? Like what kind of impact do you want to leave?
Definitely, what I was just referencing there, it is our current mission to prevent all future deforestation in the tropics. And the way to do that is to produce the foods that we need without the land requirement. And so we really want to be a leader in, at the very least, preserving the forests that we still have. We've deforested over 70% of the world's primary forests at this point. And so we really want to protect what is left. And then really be leaders in stewarding. Again, we think there's an opportunity here to possibly need less land than we even use now for making food. And so thinking about that transition and transformation of how we steward lands is something I think we feel really confident that we can be leaders in that transformation.
Okay. Okay,
Also
Cassidy,
delicious butter, but
Yeah. It was a great conversation we had, actually. So thank you so much.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.